The impossible power, the German pilots who shocked the world. You've heard of the Red Baron, you probably know about Chuck Yeager, but there's one pilot who shot down 275 enemy aircraft and survived the entire war, yet his name barely gets mentioned. Why? Because he flew for the wrong side. This is the story of Günther Rall, the third highest-scoring fighter ace in history, and the man who proved that skill in the air had nothing to do with the flag on your plane. When you think about World War II fighter pilots, your mind probably goes straight to the good guys, the Americans, the British, the brave men who took to the skis to defend freedom. And yeah, those guys were incredible, but here's what nobody talks about. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, produced some of the most skilled pilots the world has ever seen, not because they were evil, not because they believed in what their country was doing, but because they were put in situations that forced them to become the best or die trying. Günther Rall was born in 1918 in Gaggenau, a small town in southwestern Germany. His father was a merchant, and young Günther grew up in a pretty normal middle-class family. He wasn't some military fanatic. He wasn't obsessed with war. Actually, his first love was music. He played the violin and wanted to become a concert violinist. Can you imagine that? The guy who would become one of history's deadliest fighter pilots started out wanting to play classical music for a living. But life had other plans. Germany in the 1920s and 30s was a mess. The economy was destroyed after World War I. Inflation was out of control. People were desperate. And into that desperation walked Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, promising to make Germany great again. Sound familiar? It's the same playbook that works in any country when times get tough. Find someone to blame, promise easy solutions, get people angry enough to stop thinking clearly. Rall joined the German army in 1936. Not the Nazi Party, mind you, the army. There's a difference that people today don't really understand. Millions of German soldiers fought in World War II without being Nazis. They were just regular guys who got caught up in something way bigger than themselves. Some believed the propaganda. Some didn't have a choice. Some just wanted to serve their country and didn't realize what they were really fighting for until it was too late. Rall wanted to fly, that's all he cared about. The politics, the ideology, none of that mattered to him. He just wanted to be up in the sky, pushing a machine to its limits, testing himself against other pilots. So he applied to the Luftwaffe and started training as a fighter pilot in 1938. Here's something crazy. The German pilot training program was brutal, way more intense than what the Americans or British were doing at the time. Why? Because Germany knew they were going to war and they needed their pilots to be ready. The training wasn't just about flying. It was about survival, about making split-second decisions when someone's trying to kill you, about staying calm when your plane's on fire and you're 20,000 feet in the air. Rall was a natural. He picked it up fast. His instructors said he had an instinct for it, like he could feel what the plane was going to do before it happened. That's the mark of a great pilot, not just knowledge, not just skill, but that sixth sense that tells you when to pull up, when to dive, when to fire. By the time World War II started in September 1939, Rall was ready, or at least he thought he was. Nobody's really ready for war. You can train all you want, but the first time someone shoots at you for real, everything changes. The first time you see another pilot go down in flames, knowing there's a guy just like you burning alive in that cockpit, it hits different. Rall's first combat missions were during the invasion of France in May 1940. The German military at that point was unstoppable. They had better tactics, better coordination, better equipment. The French and British forces were completely overwhelmed. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. For a young fighter pilot like Rall, it must have felt like they really were invincible. He got his first kill on May 12, 1940, a French Curtiss Hawk fighter. Imagine that moment. You're 22 years old, you've trained for this, you've imagined it 1,000 times, and then it happens. You line up your shot, you press the trigger, you watch your bullets tear through another plane, and you watch it fall. There's a guy in that plane, he has a family, he had dreams, and now he's dead because you were a better shot. How do you process that? How do you live with that? The answer is you don't think about it. You can't. Because if you start thinking about it, you'll freeze up. And if you freeze up, you die, so you compartmentalize. You tell yourself it's just a job, just targets, just survival. The ones who couldn't do that didn't last long. Rall flew through the Battle of Britain in 1940, one of the most intense air campaigns in history. The Germans were trying to destroy the British Royal Air Force so they could invade Britain. It didn't work. The British pilots, fighting over their own territory with the support of radar and ground control, held them off. The Luftwaffe lost. Hitler called off the invasion. And for the first time, German pilots realized they weren't invincible after all. But Rall kept flying, kept fighting, kept racking up kills. By the end of 1940, he had 8 confirmed victories. Not bad, but nothing compared to what was coming. Then came May 1941. Rall was flying over the English Channel when British fighters jumped his squadron. In the chaos of the dogfight, he got hit. His plane was damaged, but he managed to keep it in the air and started heading back to France. Almost made it too, but right as he was about to reach the coast, his plane gave out. He crashed. The impact broke his back in 3 places. Think about that. You're a fighter pilot. Your entire life is built around flying. And now you're lying in a hospital bed, told you might never walk normally again, told your flying days are definitely over. That would break most people. That would be the end of the story. Not for Rall. He spent 8 months in the hospital, 8 months of brutal rehabilitation, learning to walk again, dealing with constant pain, and the whole time he had one goal: get back in the cockpit. The doctors said it was impossible. His superiors told him to accept a desk job, but Rall refused. He kept pushing, kept training, kept fighting through the pain. By early 1942, he convinced them to let him fly again. Against all odds, he was back. And that's when he became truly dangerous. See, surviving a crash like that changes you. Rall had already faced death and won. He had nothing left to prove and nothing left to fear. That made him calm in situations where other pilots panicked. That made him calculated when others rushed in. That made him deadly. They sent him to the Eastern Front, Russia, and that's where his kill count exploded. The air war on the Eastern Front was different from anything in the West. It was bigger, bloodier, more desperate. The Russians had way more planes than the Germans, but most of their pilots weren't well trained, especially early on. So skilled German pilots like Rall were able to rack up insane numbers of victories. But here's what people don't understand. Flying on the Eastern Front wasn't easy just because the Russians had less experienced pilots. It was actually more dangerous in a lot of ways. The weather was brutal. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. Planes would freeze up. Engines would fail. And if you got shot down over Russian territory, you were probably dead. Either from the crash, from the cold, or from Soviet troops who weren't known for taking prisoners. Plus, the Russians had numbers. For every plane you shot down, there were 5 more right behind it. You could win every single fight and still be overwhelmed. German pilots on the Eastern Front would fly 4, 5, 6 missions a day. They were exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear. And they kept flying because if they didn't, the ground troops would get slaughtered. Rall flew a Messerschmitt Bf 109, one of the best fighter planes of the war. Fast, maneuverable, well-armed. He knew that plane inside and out, could push it to its limits and beyond. He developed his own tactics, his own style. He didn't take unnecessary risks. He was patient, methodical. He'd study the enemy formation, find the weak spot, strike hard, and get out. Other pilots called him the ace maker because he was so good at teaching younger pilots how to survive. That's another thing people don't realize. Being a good fighter pilot wasn't just about killing. It was about coming home, about making sure your wingman came home, about keeping your squadron together. The flashy guys who wanted all the glory usually got themselves killed. The smart ones like Rall stayed alive by being smart. By the end of 1942, Rall had over 100 kills. By the end of 1943, he had over 200. He was one of only a handful of pilots in history to reach that number. The Germans gave him the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of their highest military decorations. He was a propaganda hero, a symbol of German air superiority. But here's the thing. By 1943, Germany was losing the war. Everyone knew it. The Americans had joined the fight. The Russians were pushing back. German cities were being bombed into rubble. The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, out of planes, out of pilots. and guys like Rall were being asked to do the impossible, to hold back an entire invasion with skill alone. He kept flying. What else could he do? Desert. His family would be punished, maybe killed, surrender. The Russians would probably shoot him on sight. He was trapped. So he did his job. He fought for his country, even as his country was committing atrocities he had no control over. April 1944. Rall was flying a mission over Romania when American P-47 Thunderbolts attacked his squadron. These weren't inexperienced Russian pilots. These were Americans, well-trained, well-equipped, flying powerful planes. A dogfight broke out. Rall got hit. Again, his plane was shot to pieces, but once again his skill kept him alive. He managed to crash land. His left thumb was nearly severed. He was bleeding badly, but he survived. Again. Another long recovery. More time in the hospital. More people telling him his flying days were over. And once again, he refused to accept it. By November 1944, he was back in action. But everything had changed. The war was clearly lost. Allied bombers were destroying Germany day and night. Soviet armies were closing in from the east, American and British armies from the west. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of what it had been. Fuel was so scarce that some squadrons couldn't even fly. New pilots were being sent into combat with barely any training. They'd last maybe a week before getting shot down. Rall kept flying, kept training new pilots, kept trying to keep his men alive in a war that was already over. His final victory, his 275th confirmed kill, came in early 1945. He was appointed commander of a fighter wing, trying to organize a defense that everyone knew was pointless. On April 8, 1945, American forces captured the airfield where Rall was stationed. 1 month before Germany surrendered, he became a prisoner of war. And that's where most people think the story ends. German pilot gets captured, war ends. He probably got executed or disappeared into a Soviet gulag, right? That's what happened to a lot of German soldiers. But not Rall, because here's where the story gets really interesting. The Americans who captured him realized who they had, one of the greatest fighter pilots in history. They didn't treat him like a monster. They treated him like a fellow pilot, like someone who had just been on the opposite side. They asked him about tactics, about the planes he flew, about his experiences, and Rall answered honestly. He told them he never joined the Nazi Party. He told them he fought for Germany, not for Hitler. He told them he was just doing his job, same as them, and you know what? They believed him because it was true. After the war ended, Rall was held as a POW for about a year. During that time, American pilots would come to interview him, learn from him. Some of them became friends. Can you imagine that? Guys who were trying to kill each other months ago, now sitting around talking about flying like old buddies. Rall was released in 1946. He went back to Germany, which was now divided and destroyed. His hometown was in ruins. The economy was shattered. Millions were dead or displaced. Everything he had known was gone, and he had to figure out how to live in this new world. He tried a few different jobs, worked in his brother's wine shop for a while, but flying was in his blood. He couldn't just give it up. So when West Germany started rebuilding its air force in the 1950s as part of NATO to defend against the Soviet Union, Rall joined. Yeah, the same guy who had fought against the Americans and British was now their ally, because the Cold War had started and suddenly West Germany was on the Western side. The irony is pretty wild when you think about it. The Soviets, who had been allies with America and Britain during World War II, were now the enemy, and Germany, which had been the enemy, was now an ally. Politics is weird like that. Rall became a general in the new German Air Force, the Bundeswehr. He helped train a new generation of German pilots. But this time, they were learning to fly F-86 Sabres and F-104 Starfighters, American jets, and they were learning to defend democracy, not destroy it. During this time, something remarkable happened. Rall reached out to American and British pilots he had fought against during the war. Some of them he had shot down, some of them had shot at him, and they started meeting up, talking, sharing stories. They formed friendships that lasted the rest of their lives. One of his closest friends was Chuck Yeager. Yeah, that Chuck Yeager, the first man to break the sound barrier, American hero. They met at an air show in the 1970s and hit it off immediately, because at the end of the day, they were both pilots. They both understood what it was like up there. The fear, the adrenaline, the brotherhood. The flag on your plane didn't matter as much as people thought. Rall retired from the military in 1975, but he didn't disappear. He became an advocate for reconciliation between former enemies. He gave lectures about his experiences. He talked about the difference between following orders and following evil. He was honest about what he had seen and done. He was also honest about the Holocaust. When people asked him if he knew about the concentration camps, he said no. Most German soldiers on the front lines didn't. The Nazi regime kept it hidden. But he also said that ignorance wasn't an excuse, that every German had a responsibility to confront what their country had done, that you don't get to say, "I was just following orders," and walk away clean. That kind of honesty is rare. A lot of German veterans refused to talk about the war. They were ashamed. They were defensive. They made excuses, but Rall faced it head-on. He admitted he fought for the wrong side. He admitted that skill and honor don't mean anything if you're fighting for an evil cause. But he also refused to apologize for surviving, for doing his job as a soldier, for being good at what he did. It's complicated. History is messy like that. People aren't just good or evil. They're human. They make choices based on the information they have and the situation they're in. And sometimes, the best people end up on the wrong side through no fault of their own. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Rall became a kind of living legend in the aviation community. Fighter pilots from all over the world wanted to meet him, hear his stories, learn from him. He'd go to air shows and be swarmed by fans asking for autographs. American pilots, British pilots, Russian pilots, all of them respected what he had done, even if they didn't agree with who he had done it for. He was also part of a very exclusive club, the Jet Fighter Aces. After the war, Rall had transitioned to flying jets, and he was one of the few World War II aces who successfully made that transition. He understood both prop planes and jets, both eras of air combat. That made his knowledge incredibly valuable. The German government honored him multiple times. Other countries honored him too. He received medals and recognition from nations that had fought against Germany, because by then, enough time had passed. The wounds had healed enough. People could separate the man from the regime he had served. But not everyone was happy about it. Some people thought he shouldn't be celebrated, that anyone who fought for Nazi Germany, regardless of whether they were personally a Nazi, should be condemned, that there was no such thing as a good German soldier in World War II. It's a fair argument. The Wehrmacht, the German military, participated in war crimes, helped facilitate the Holocaust through their conquests. You can't completely separate yourself from that just by saying you were following orders. Rall's counter-argument was this: he was a fighter pilot, he fought other pilots, he didn't kill civilians, he didn't participate in atrocities, he did his job in the air and nothing more. And after the war, he spent the rest of his life promoting peace and understanding. At what point does a man get to move past his mistakes? At what point does redemption become possible? These are questions without easy answers, but they're important questions, because if we say that everyone who fought for the wrong side is irredeemable, then we're saying that people can't change, that context doesn't matter, that there's no difference between a concentration camp guard and a fighter pilot who shot down enemy planes. Most historians today land somewhere in the middle. Yes, Rall fought for an evil regime. Yes, that complicates his legacy. But no, he personally didn't commit war crimes. And yes, his post-war actions showed genuine remorse and a desire to make amends. You can acknowledge his skill as a pilot while also acknowledging the problematic nature of what he was fighting for. Günther Rall died on October 4, 2009, at the age of 91. He had lived through the entire rise and fall of Nazi Germany, survived the complete destruction of his country, watched it rebuild into a democracy, saw the Cold War begin and end, witnessed the dawn of the jet age and the space age. He lived long enough to see Germany reunited and accepted back into the community of nations. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, fellow pilots, military officials, friends from all over the world. The German Air Force gave him full military honors, and American veterans showed up to pay their respects to a former enemy who had become a friend. So why don't more people know about him? Why isn't his name as famous as the Red Baron or Chuck Yeager? Because he fought for Germany, that's it. That's the only reason. If Günther Rall had been born in America or Britain and racked up 275 kills fighting against the Axis, he'd be a household name. There would be movies about him, books, documentaries, but because he wore a German uniform, his story gets buried, hidden away, treated as uncomfortable. But here's the thing, uncomfortable stories are the most important ones, the stories that don't fit neatly into good guys versus bad guys. The stories that force us to think about context and choices and morality in complex situations. Those are the stories we need to hear. Günther Rall's story is a reminder that war isn't simple, that the guys on the other side aren't monsters. They're people, skilled people, brave people, people who might have been your friend if you had been born in a different place. And that's terrifying, because it means that any of us, under the right circumstances, could end up fighting for the wrong side. It's also a reminder that redemption is possible, that you're not defined forever by the worst thing your country did, that you can acknowledge the past, learn from it, and spend the rest of your life trying to be better. Rall could have disappeared after the war, hidden his identity, refused to talk about it, but he didn't. He faced it, owned it, and used his experiences to promote peace. His legacy in the aviation world is secure. Fighter pilots still study his tactics. His interviews and writings are used in military academies around the world. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 he flew is considered one of the greatest fighter planes ever built, in large part because of pilots like him who pushed it to its limits. But his broader legacy is more complicated, and maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't need all our heroes to be simple. Maybe it's important to have figures who make us think, who challenge our assumptions, who remind us that history is full of gray areas. If you're interested in World War II aviation, you need to know about Günther Rall, not because he was a Nazi, he wasn't, but because he was one of the most skilled fighter pilots who ever lived, because his story shows the difference between skill and morality, because he represents thousands of German soldiers who got caught up in something bigger than themselves and had to live with the consequences. And because his story asks us an uncomfortable question: what would you have done if you had been born in Germany in 1918, if you had grown up in poverty and chaos, if your country had been offering you a way out, a chance to serve, a chance to fly? Would you have said no? Would you have seen through the propaganda? Would you have been brave enough to resist? Most people like to think they would have been on the right side, that they would have been the ones hiding Jews in their attic or sabotaging the Nazi war effort. But statistically, most people went along with it, not because they were evil, but because they were human, because resistance is hard, because going against your entire society takes a kind of courage that most people don't have. Rall wasn't a resistance fighter, he wasn't a hero in that sense, but he also wasn't a villain. He was a soldier, a pilot, a man who did what he thought was right at the time, realized later that he had been wrong, and spent the rest of his life trying to make up for it. That's not a simple story, but it's a true one, and true stories are always more valuable than simple ones. The next time you hear about a World War II ace, remember Günther Rall. Remember that the number 3 spot on the all-time list belongs to a guy most people have never heard of. Remember that skill doesn't care about politics. And remember that everyone has a story more complicated than you think. Rall's record of 275 aerial victories stands as a testament to his skill in the cockpit. Only 2 pilots in history scored more: Erich Hartmann with 352 and Gerhard Barkhorn with 301. Both were also German. Both also flew on the Eastern Front, and both also faced the same complicated legacy that Rall did. The reason these numbers are so much higher than American or British aces is partly because German pilots flew way more missions. They didn't have a rotation system. You flew until you were killed, captured, or the war ended. American pilots would fly a certain number of missions and then get sent home. German pilots just kept going, day after day, mission after mission, until they couldn't anymore. It's also because the Eastern Front was target-rich. Soviet aircraft were everywhere, so if you survived long enough to get good, you could rack up incredible numbers. But surviving was the hard part. The life expectancy of a new German pilot on the Eastern Front by 1943 was measured in weeks, sometimes days. Rall survived because he was smart, because he learned from his mistakes, because he didn't take stupid risks, because he understood that the goal wasn't to be a hero, the goal was to come home. And he did come home, against all odds, through crashes and injuries and 5 years of constant combat. He came home, built a new life, made peace with former enemies, and lived to be an old man. That's rare. Most of the guys he flew with didn't make it. Most of the pilots on both sides didn't make it. Fighter pilot was one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. Your life expectancy was measured in missions flown, and Rall flew hundreds of them. So yeah, Günther Rall, third highest scoring ace in history, 275 confirmed kills, survived being shot down multiple times, broke his back and came back to fly, fought in the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front, became a general in NATO, made friends with the men who tried to kill him, lived to be 91 years old. His story is proof that history is complicated, that people are complicated, that you can be incredibly skilled at something and still be on the wrong side, and that it's possible to acknowledge past mistakes while still respecting someone's abilities. The aviation community remembers him fondly. The historical community treats him with caution, and most people don't know his name at all, but now you do, and maybe that's enough. Check out the next video to learn about another forgotten story from World War II.